as we've said many times, truth is the first casualty of war. We know that in a conflict, both sides, all sides, trade in propaganda, and it's an essential part of winning the information side of the war, the hearts and minds. All sides engaging it, we know that. The wrapper around that is the media, and the media desperately trying to keep up with the guy out there with his smartphone being way ahead of the game, and the urgency to get there, say something dramatic and get there first, sometimes means the media actually get it wrong. So it's, I don't want to feel sorry for them, as I said before, but it's actually been tough for them, hasn't it?
I think it has, and I think there were several examples. We don't want to embarrass anybody in the podcast, but there's several examples and pretty high-profile channels, national channels, that have found themselves getting a bit unstuck with this stuff. And I think part of the issue is the immediacy, and part of the issue is, particularly modern wars, we've normally had embedded journalists with our military. And if you go back through the wars, even Second World War, there was some false reporting in the newspapers because nobody wanted to see people's morale drop, and they didn't really want to tell you what was actually going on. And because it took so long to get the news from the front and people could massage it. So now you have embedded personnel to get a report from what's actually happening, but they only see it through that side, and the journalists are always looking for the other angle. So the second bit of this, apart from the immediacy, is also where the journalists get their news from. And particularly in the Israel-Hamas conflict, it cropped up over the last couple of weeks because the Israeli Defense Force has been escorting national journalists to show them what's going on by taking them into Gaza, but have been very careful to limit what they film, and will not let them interview anybody, and only showing them certain things. So inevitably the media go, hang on a minute, we're being used here. Mm-hmm. You're only showing us what you want us to show. What are the things that you don't want us to see, and why? That's the role of the journalists. So part of the issue has been them going, hang on, we're getting more and more uncomfortable with this, that we're only seeing one perspective. We do need to see a balanced perspective. And of course, that's caused all sorts of furore because people have suggested, well, why don't you trust the Israelis? They're telling you the truth. Why are you suggesting they're not? It's not about the truth. It's about journalism trying to look at this from lots of perspectives. And I think there's some really good examples of how this has been. The tunnels, you remember the tunnels under the Al-Shifa hospital? The Israelis were clearly convinced that these were being used by Hamas, hiding under hospitals, which is illegal under the Geneva Convention, and therefore Israel wanted to show the world that they were under there. They showcased some Kalashnikovs in some of the hospital rooms.
All neatly laid out.
And the press went, okay, but there are lots of weapons out here. Right. Then they found a tunnel entrance and they sent a drone in, and there was a tunnel that links up to the main Hamas-controlled network. There. That's the proof they've been using it. But of course, when you actually look a bit more deeply, Israel's responsible for digging some of those tunnels, so they would have known where some of them were anyway. And when you look at the video footage of some of the rooms underground, I'm not an expert, but when you look at it, it looks a bit like a building that's been derelict for a few years. There was no sign of any activity recently, and even the sinks looked, stainless steel sinks that looked like they'd not been used for 20 years. Now, it may well have been that they've been used by Hamas and were storing weapons and they've cleared them all out. But it didn't look like it. And therefore, from an Israeli perspective, they were trying to say, there's the evidence, the smoking gun, there's a tunnel, it's in the hospital grounds. But from a media perspective, they're going, okay, we see that. Yes, there are tunnels, they probably have been used by Hamas, but there's not that smoking gun. And that's created, again, more friction with the media. And of course, because the population reading the media is so polarised around this, it's proved very, very difficult. And a good example of the timeliness, you remember the, which hospital? Al Arab Hospital. So back on the 20th of October, where a There was an explosion in the car park outside the hospital. Hamas said, Israel has bombed this. 500 people have died. This is an atrocity. It's a war crime. Uproar around the world. 48 hours later, when you actually look at it carefully, you go, the cars weren't blown away. They were set fire and burnt out, but they were still largely where they were parked. That's more of a fuel fire than a bomb exploding. Likewise, if you look at I was a weapons instructor, you look at the impacts of the tiles on the roofs nearby. Any explosion normally blows all of those to pieces. They were still resting on the building. There wasn't a big hole in the ground where normally a bomb would go into. And when you looked at the angles of everything, you went, it's come from the opposite direction. And there was clearly a lot more evidence to suggest that actually this was an errant rocket. You were talking about the Hamas rockets. They're unguided. They're full of fuel. And if they go wrong, they can land almost anywhere. With the benefit of hindsight, almost certainly that was the case. But the irony there was the first people to report it were Hamas, and therefore that's the story that got out. And even when the most likely version of the truth came out, there were so many cynics then that went, no, I believe the first version. I'm not going to believe that second one because the first one suits my narrative. How does the media operate in that space?
It's difficult. And of course, people will believe anything. And as you say, people will believe what they want to believe. I mean, there's a big growing view at the moment that the attack on the 7th of October never happened. And you think, well, how does that happen? So, information sort of spirals out of control. However, my view is that it's not the media's job to fight the war or to influence the war. It's not their job to entertain us or give us, hyperventilation. Their job is to tell us as best they can what's going on. Now, if I was a journalist or an anchor, I'd always want Sean Bell by my side, because it's only going to take you, a minute it took you to say what you've just said about the bomb outside the hospital. Okay, it's going to take you half an hour to analyse the scene. That's not, okay, there's not thousands of you, but there's enough to make sure that you don't allow the journalist to hip shoot and come to the wrong conclusion. Very hard to row back from the first one, and damage is done. So I don't give them a free pass. I think they ought to be more careful. If they lose a day for it, and when the smoke's blown away, they realise the building isn't flattened, it's actually still standing, then I think that's the price they have to pay.
The only disagreement I have is that, let's use an example away from the Israel conflict, which has all sorts of other dimensions of polarised view. If we look at the Ukraine conflict, I have had now the best part of 2 years with Sky looking at some of this stuff. And for example, regularly we'd have something like, breaking news, Russia has blown up a school in Ukraine. And there'd be right, Sean, can you talk about that? And they would ask me, and I would go, well, first of all, why would Russia attack a school? I mean, take away the melodrama. Why would they do that? There's no reason why they would do that. Secondly, were there any kids there? Because when you say school, it implies there's kids there. Are there any kids there? Oh, well, there's no kids died. Okay. Thirdly, then, well, what was that school being used for? It's got lots of open areas, halls and stuff like that. Was it being used by the Ukrainian military as a meeting point or a rallying point or, don't know. Because that would make a legitimate target. And finally, again, Russia hasn't been that effective at precision striking, but Ukraine has been very effective at shooting down Russian missiles and drones. And when it shoots them down, they still come to Earth and the explosive is still in them, so they still blow up, but not at their intended targets. And far more debris is falling on Ukraine where it wasn't intended to fall than ever missiles land on their intended target. Far more. If you believe the Ukrainian statistics, over 90% of the stuff is being shot down. So that school might well have been impacted,
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, but my deference to the media I'm seeing is asking that question and then actually moderates how it reports it.
Well, so what you're doing, you're keeping your media outlet safe. You're applying your military analysis capability, the years of service in multiple jobs and tours into very difficult situations, using all of that knowledge to first ask all the difficult questions and then apply some analysis to it, so that when the media that you work for comes out with something, it's been tested thoroughly. Sometimes, other journalists don't do that. They don't have a Sean Bell, or they decide, they're kind of in charge of the thing, and that's where mistake. And the mistakes can be.
No, I agree with that, but I would also turn around and say I think one of the issues, returning to the Israel conflict, is that it's really difficult to report in the Israel conflict because it's such a polarized view. There isn't a middle ground. You're either with us or you're against us.
Mm.
And the danger is everybody wants to believe what they want to believe. And it's quite difficult, therefore, to look objectively at a set of circumstances, and particularly when you do analysis, because you are looking to a bit of a crystal ball. You are going, here's the facts as we know them. But as you said, grey hairs, a lot of experience, I can put a bit of conjecture about where, my apologies, no hair, about what this entails. But I don't know. But suddenly there's a different version that people go, right, I don't like that version, I'm going to deny it.
Yeah, we're always going to get that.
And that polarizing is much more acute with the Israel conflict than it ever is with the Russian conflict.
Yeah, maybe the rule is, engage brain, be cautious, be a bit suspicious of what you first see, and then do your best.
I agree with that, and I think not for now because we don't have time, but I think you were talking about there's some really interesting other areas of this that we could explore.
Well, fake news, which we ought to get into, because we know it's a growing thing in society. Whichever side of the many fences we've got you're on, it's a big issue. Artificial intelligence is coming into play in a really nauseating way, so we ought to spend some time looking at that as well, I think.
And I think that's part of why we're doing this podcast, isn't it? Is to try to give an informed perspective as best we can from the data we know and from the facts we know, based on a fair bit of experience as well. So.
Right.